Michael Jones sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of bills, his brow furrowed in concentration. The light from the late afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over the house. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name and where the Jones family was considered one of the neighborhood's most picture-perfect families. Tiffany, Michael's wife, hummed in the background as she prepared dinner. Their two children, Luke and Emma, played quietly in the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. It all seemed so ideal, so flawless. But underneath it all, there was an invisible weight pressing down on Michael. He glanced at Tiffany, who was lost in her own world, cutting vegetables for the evening meal. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her smile was bright, full of warmth. Michael's heart clenched as he watched her. He had once loved her with everything he had, but that love had slowly been replaced with something else, something darker. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the calculations of bills, debt, and financial ruin. The weight of his responsibilities was suffocating him. Tiffany was blissfully unaware, floating in her bubble of optimism, believing everything was as it should be. Michael's thoughts turned darker, more focused on the only way out he could see, a solution that would cost Tiffany everything. He had started researching insurance policies weeks ago, looking for a way to secure the life he dreamed of. Tiffany's life insurance policy had always been there, but now it felt like the key to everything. The money would cover their debts, secure a future for the children, and set him free. Michael couldn't help but think how easy it would be to end it all, to take what he felt was owed to him. Tiffany's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, smiling at him from across the room. "Are you okay? You've been awfully quiet tonight." Michael smiled back, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. Long day at work." She nodded, her attention returning to the stove, unaware of the storm brewing inside her husband's mind. Michael's fingers tapped restlessly on the table. He had already made up his mind. It was a simple plan, a plan that would set everything in motion. Tiffany would be gone, and the money would be his. It would all be over. He stared at her for a long moment, trying to picture his life without her, without the children, but all he could see was the weight being lifted off his shoulders, the escape, the relief. As the children's laughter continued to fill the house, Michael pushed the thoughts aside for a moment, focusing on the present. He had a family, a beautiful life on the surface, but beneath it all he was sinking, slowly, quietly, deeper into the darkness. Tiffany called out from the kitchen, "Michael, can you set the table?" He nodded, standing up and walking toward her. He didn't want to think about the future right now, not with dinner ready, not with Tiffany smiling at him, unaware, but the plan was already forming in his mind. Everything would change soon. Michael sat at his desk in the dimly lit office of the manufacturing plant, the hum of the fluorescent lights above almost deafening in the quiet of the late afternoon. His mind, however, wasn't on the paperwork in front of him. It was on the stack of bills at home, the endless calls from creditors, the mounting debt that seemed to grow faster than he could keep up with. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a reminder, a final notice from the bank. The weight of it hung heavy in his chest. He had tried everything. Cut back on groceries, skipped meals, delayed bills, but it was never enough. The sinking feeling in his stomach was becoming all too familiar. Tiffany didn't know. She was still optimistic, still trying to make the best of everything. She was unaware of the financial black hole that was consuming their family. Michael stared at the screen of his phone, the words on the notice swimming in front of his eyes. He tried to push the panic back down, but it clawed its way to the surface. His hands trembled as he swiped through the list of upcoming bills. Rent, utilities, the car loan. Everything had piled up. But then his thoughts turned to something else. His eyes shifted to his inbox, where an email from Guardian Life Insurance waited, its subject line bold and glaring. Confirmation of policy upgrade. Michael clicked on it. The email outlined the details of Tiffany's life insurance policy, which had recently been increased at her request. Michael knew about the policy. It had always been a safety net, but now it was a lifeline. The coverage was substantial enough to wipe out their debts and leave him with enough to start over, to escape. Michael felt a strange mix of relief and dread wash over him. He had done the math a dozen times. The numbers never lied. He just needed to act, soon. The thought lingered in his mind as he scanned the policy document again, the figures standing out starkly. $750,000. It would be enough, more than enough. He rubbed his temples, trying to think clearly. This wasn't supposed to be how it happened. Tiffany didn't deserve it. She had always been there for him. She was the glue that held everything together. But the weight of their financial troubles was crushing him, and he couldn't see a way out. Michael's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Tiffany. "Hey, I was thinking we could take the kids on a little weekend trip soon. Just need to get away for a bit, you know?" The smile she put on in her message hit him like a fist. She had no idea, no clue about the depths of his despair. All she wanted was a quick escape, a weekend away, a moment of peace. But Michael couldn't give her that. Not now. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He knew what he had to do. It was the only way. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped by debt, drowning in pressure. Tiffany, the kids, they deserved better. He needed to provide. They all needed a way out. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a cold chill running down his spine. He took a deep breath, then began typing a message to the insurance agent. "I'd like to discuss the claim options as soon as possible." The message sent, and Michael sat back in his chair staring at the screen. He couldn't bring himself to feel guilt, not yet. There was only the numbness, the desire to escape, to break free from the endless cycle of debt and despair. Michael stood up, walking over to the window and gazing out at the street below. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. The world outside didn't know what was coming, but Michael knew. The pieces were already falling into place. He exhaled slowly, then turned and walked back to his desk, grabbing the phone. The plan was set. There was no turning back now. The day seemed to drag on, each passing minute heavier than the last. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the screen of his laptop. He had just typed the final words in his email to the insurance agent. "I'd like to discuss the claim options as soon as possible." He paused, staring at the words on the screen, then hit send. The room felt colder now, even though the heating was on, and the sound of his wife and children moving around the house echoed in his ears, an eerie reminder of the life he was preparing to destroy. Tiffany walked into the kitchen with a smile, her hands full of groceries. "Michael, can you help me with these?" she asked, clearly in a cheerful mood. The brightness in her voice felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "Of course," he replied quickly, standing up and taking the bags from her. As he moved around the kitchen, his mind was elsewhere. He was already imagining the life that awaited him once he was free. The weight of the bills would be gone. The pressure, the constant fear, it would all disappear. But as he unpacked the groceries, Tiffany began talking about their plans for the weekend. "Maybe we can finally take that trip to the lake, just the four of us. We need to relax, right? It's been such a long time since we had a break." Michael nodded, though the words barely registered. His thoughts were preoccupied with the plan he was setting in motion. "Yeah, that sounds great. We'll get away for a couple of days. Just need to finish a few things here and we'll be all set." Tiffany gave him a warm smile, but Michael could barely muster the strength to return it. She was so unaware, so trusting, and yet that very trust made it all so much easier to deceive her. She believed in him, in their family, and that belief was what would allow him to pull off his plan. He finished putting the groceries away, his hands moving mechanically. His mind was already several steps ahead, rehearsing what he would say when the time came, how he would act surprised when the fire started, how he would feign helplessness when Tiffany was trapped inside the car. It would be seamless, easy. No one would suspect a thing. The plan was unfolding perfectly, and yet a part of him felt a sharp pang of guilt, but it was quickly smothered by his overwhelming desire to escape. The relief he would feel once everything was over. He would never have to worry about money again. Tiffany, the kids, they would be taken care of and he could start over. The perfect escape. Tiffany stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron. "Michael, you okay?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. She could sense something was off. Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." She didn't press further, and Michael let out a silent sigh of relief. If she noticed his coldness, she didn't let it show. Everything was falling into place, and the tension in his chest seemed to ease for just a moment. The evening passed quickly, with Tiffany organizing the kids for bed while Michael went through his final preparations. He ran through his plan one last time in his mind. He would need to be quick. The fire needed to start in a place that would guarantee Tiffany wouldn't escape. The kids would be far enough away to be safe, but close enough to make it look like an accident. His phone buzzed again. It was the insurance agent. The subject line read, "Reclaim options, let's schedule a call." Michael opened the message, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed his reply, confirming the time for a discussion the following morning. But before he could finish, the sound of Tiffany's voice brought him back to reality. "The kids are asleep," she said softly, walking into the living room. "Do you want to watch a movie? We haven't had a night just for us in so long." The offer hung in the air, but Michael knew he couldn't let himself relax. Not yet. "I think I'll pass tonight," he said, standing up. "Got some things I need to finish up." Tiffany nodded, understanding but a little disappointed. "All right, well, I'll leave the TV on for you if you change your mind." As she walked upstairs, Michael felt the weight of the moment. He had pushed her away for the night, and he knew that when the time came, she would be completely unaware of what was about to happen. With a deep breath, Michael opened his laptop again. He checked the email one last time. Everything was set. Everything was in place. Now, all he had to do was wait. And the waiting felt unbearable. It was late evening when Michael finally drove the family car down a secluded road, the tires humming over the asphalt as the dark trees blurred by. Tiffany sat beside him, chatting about trivial things, oblivious to the weight in his chest. The kids in the back had fallen asleep, their soft breathing filling the silence between him and Tiffany. Everything felt surreal, like the calm before a storm, but the storm was coming, and Michael was ready to unleash it. "Are we almost there?" Tiffany asked, looking up from her phone. "I thought you said we were going to a park." Michael forced a smile, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "It's just up ahead. You'll like it. Nice and quiet." She smiled back, her face glowing in the dim light of the car. He had loved that smile once, but now it was a reminder of everything he was about to take away. He glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the kids, their small faces peaceful in sleep. It made his stomach churn, but there was no turning back now. He had already crossed that line. They reached the remote spot he had scouted earlier. The area was dark, surrounded by trees, the perfect place for no one to hear or see anything. It would all be over soon. The relief, the freedom, the money. Michael turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment, staring at the ignition. Tiffany was talking again, asking where they were. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. He had to do this. He had no choice. He couldn't live with this weight anymore. The plans, the lies, the deceit. It was all leading to this moment. "Michael, why are we stopping?" Tiffany's voice carried a note of concern. "I thought you said we were going to a park. Why is it so dark here?" Michael turned to face her, his expression calm, betraying no hint of the turmoil inside. "I wanted to make sure we had some time alone, no distractions." Tiffany tilted her head, a confused look crossing her face, but she didn't press further. She smiled again, her eyes sparkling with a trust he no longer deserved. With shaking hands, Michael opened the glove compartment and took out a small object. A gasoline lighter. The plan had been set for days. The fire would be his escape. The flames would consume everything, leaving behind nothing but ashes and an insurance claim. He had researched the best way to ensure Tiffany wouldn't survive. Everything was calculated. He pulled the lighter out and glanced at Tiffany one last time. This was it. He could see the love in her eyes, the genuine affection she still had for him. The guilt hit him like a hammer, but it didn't matter. He had already convinced himself that this was the only way forward. He couldn't live this way anymore. "Michael, what's that?" Tiffany asked, her voice now laced with concern. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just reached over, locked the doors, and started the fire. The flame flickered to life, and for a moment, he could only watch in frozen disbelief as the gas fumes ignited, the car quickly filling with smoke. The scent of burning fuel reached his nose, and panic surged through him. But it wasn't the panic of fear for Tiffany. It was the panic of the plan going into motion. The kids woke in a panic, crying in confusion, but they were far enough from the fire that they wouldn't be harmed. Tiffany screamed, her voice filled with terror. She reached for the door, but it was locked. She twisted the handle, unable to get out, her face pale with horror as the flames began to lick the windows. Michael just sat there, hands still gripping the wheel, as the fire intensified, a cruel smile flickering on his lips. He could hear Tiffany's desperate cries, but it didn't matter. He had to stay calm. He had to be the man he promised himself to be. He was going to escape. Everything he had ever dreamed of was right in front of him, just beyond the fire. Her voice became muffled as the smoke thickened. He could see her in the reflection of the rearview mirror, her face a mixture of confusion and terror. It should have made him feel something, but it didn't. The fire grew stronger, crackling as it spread. The heat radiated through the car, and Michael could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Time seemed to stand still, the world outside slipping away into a haze of smoke and flame. The desperate cries of his wife faded as he shifted his gaze to the mirror again. She was gone. A moment later, he turned away from the scene. He didn't look back as he drove away, leaving the destruction behind. The last remnants of his family, of his life, were now ashes. He could feel his hands trembling now, but not from fear. From something else, something darker. He had done it. It was over. Everything had changed. The fire had been raging for what felt like hours, though in reality, it had only been minutes. Michael drove away, the sound of the flames fading as he put miles between himself and the destruction he had just caused. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, but his mind was strangely calm. It was over. Tiffany, the woman he had once loved, was gone. The children were safe, and the life insurance policy he had carefully planned for was now within reach. He didn't look back. There was no need to. The city lights in the distance looked peaceful, serene, completely unaware of the horror that had unfolded just miles behind them. It was exactly what Michael had wanted. A clean break, a fresh start. Everything he had ever dreamed of was within his grasp. As he pulled into his driveway, his heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was a strange sense of triumph. He had done it. The chaos, the lies, the sacrifice. It had all led to this moment. But as Michael stepped out of the car, something felt off. The silence of the night seemed too loud, as though the world had stopped spinning, holding its breath. He had planned for everything, or so he thought. He walked toward the house, his footsteps slow, deliberate. The lights were on inside. Tiffany's absence should have felt freeing, but instead it felt like something was suffocating him. The house was still, just as it had always been, but now it was empty in a way he couldn't explain. He had expected to feel relief, but all he felt was a strange sense of dread. As he entered the house, he immediately noticed something strange. His phone was buzzing with notifications, messages from Tiffany's family. It didn't make sense. They didn't know anything yet. Did they? He ignored the messages, walking into the living room where everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The kids' toys were scattered on the floor. The TV was still playing in the background. But there was a new unease in the air, something he hadn't anticipated. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was the police. The number was unlisted and his throat went dry. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer. But then the phone rang again. His hand shook as he picked it up, pressing it to his ear. "Mr. Jones," the voice on the other end said, a calm but firm tone. "We need you to come down to the station. There's been an incident." Michael's mind went blank. He could hear the words, but they didn't make sense. "An incident? What do you mean?" "There's been a fire, a fatality. We have some questions for you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His thoughts were spinning. Fatality? Tiffany? No, it couldn't be. He had made sure everything would go according to plan. He had checked and double-checked. There was no way they could know. Not yet. I'm sorry," Michael stammered. "What are you talking about? Tiffany? She was inside, yes, but it was an accident. It was just—" "Mr. Jones, please come down to the station," the voice interrupted, sounding much sterner now. "We'll explain everything there." The line went dead, and for a moment Michael stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, disbelief and panic rushing through him. He couldn't breathe. He had planned everything so carefully. This was supposed to be a clean break. He dropped the phone onto the table, his heart racing. The realization hit him. The investigators were already onto something. He had no idea how they knew, but the police wouldn't have called if they didn't have a reason. Panic began to claw at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's fine, Michael, just stay calm. You've done this before." He tried to convince himself, but he could already feel the walls closing in. His eyes darted around the house, searching for something, anything that might explain why he felt like a predator now, trapped in his own web of lies. He had killed for a fresh start, but now it seemed as though his past was catching up with him faster than he could outrun it. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the door. "It's just a misunderstanding," he thought. "You're not guilty. It was an accident." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The truth was already starting to surface. The weight of it was too much. With a final glance at the empty house, Michael stepped outside, the night air cold against his skin. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the street as he made his way to the car. The police would find out everything soon enough. There was no escaping the consequences now. As he pulled out of the driveway, the flashing lights of the police cars in his rearview mirror seemed to mock him. The life he had so carefully planned for was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. Michael's heart raced as he sat in the sterile, cold interrogation room, his hands clammy as they rested on the table in front of him. The air seemed thick with tension, and every tick of the clock on the wall echoed in his mind. The police had already begun their questioning, asking routine questions that felt like sharp, uncomfortable pokes into the life he had worked so hard to keep hidden. Detective Hayes sat across from him, her eyes steady and watchful, a quiet intensity in her gaze. Michael tried to keep his composure, but he could feel the pressure building, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Every word he spoke felt rehearsed, too calm for someone who had just lost a wife. "How long have you and Tiffany been married, Mr. Jones?" Detective Hayes asked, her voice smooth but probing. 11 years, Michael answered, his voice steady. He had been practicing the responses, rehearsing in his mind how to appear grief-stricken yet coherent. He knew they would try to find inconsistencies. "And you've been having financial troubles?" she pushed, flipping through a file in front of her, not looking up but clearly analyzing his every reaction. Michael nodded, a sigh escaping his lips. "Yes, it's been tough. I've tried to keep it from Tiffany, but it's hard. Bills piling up, debt from the business. She didn't know the extent of it." Detective Hayes raised an eyebrow, seemingly unconvinced. "Interesting. You were having a hard time, yet you recently increased her life insurance policy. I find that unusual." Michael's stomach dropped. The mention of the policy hit him like a sucker punch. His mind raced to find a plausible excuse, but all he could do was fumble with his fingers on the table, trying to appear calm. I thought it was just a precaution," he stammered. "She was always worried about our future, about the kids. I wanted to make sure she was covered. That's all." There was a long pause. The detective didn't speak immediately. She just looked at him, her eyes sharp, calculating. Michael's breath became shallow, and he tried to steady himself. "You know, Michael," Hayes began, her voice lowering, "we've been looking into the fire, and there's something we found. Something that doesn't sit right." Michael's pulse quickened. He swallowed, trying to maintain his composure, but the words hung in the air like a thick fog. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, though inside panic was beginning to claw at him. "The gasoline we found at the scene? It was poured deliberately," Hayes continued, her voice cutting through the silence. "It wasn't an accident. You didn't just lose control of the situation. You created it." Michael's blood ran cold. He could feel the walls closing in. He had been so careful, so precise. How could they know? "Is this really necessary?" he tried to argue, his voice rising a bit, though he quickly lowered it again. "It was a tragic accident. We've been through this already. You can't just make these assumptions." Detective Hayes' eyes narrowed, her gaze intense. "You're right. We can't make assumptions. But you know what we can do, Michael. We can look at all the evidence. We found traces of gasoline. And there's something else, something strange." She slid a piece of paper across the table, a piece of paper with a bank transaction printed on it. The date was recent, just days before Tiffany's death. Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was a large cash withdrawal from his account. The sum was substantial, far too much for someone struggling financially, someone who had claimed he could barely pay his bills. He could feel the sweat forming at the back of his neck as he glanced down at the paper. His hands gripped the table to steady himself. The air seemed to get even thicker, heavier with each passing second. "This," Detective Hayes said, her voice dripping with suspicion, "doesn't seem like the action of someone who was drowning in debt, does it?" Michael swallowed hard. His mind spun, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. The police were starting to connect the dots. They were piecing together the truth he had been so carefully trying to bury. He could already see the walls closing in, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. He had to stay composed. He had to keep lying. "It was a mistake," Michael muttered, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. I took out the money for something else. It's not related to—" "Not related?" Hayes cut him off. "It's exactly related, Michael. We've been talking to the insurance company, and we're starting to put the pieces together. Your increased life insurance policy, The large withdrawal, the gasoline, the deliberate setting of the fire. You've made a series of very strange decisions in the days leading up to her death. Michael's breath caught in his throat. She was closing in, and the more he spoke, the more incriminating his answers became. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't give up now. He had already come this far. "This is ridiculous," he said quickly, his voice gaining strength, though his heart was hammering in his chest. "You can't do this. I loved her. You're not thinking clearly." The detective didn't flinch. She simply leaned back in her chair, her eyes still fixed on him. "No, Michael, I don't think you were thinking clearly when you made the decision to kill your wife." Michael froze. The words hung in the air like poison, and for the first time since entering the room, he wasn't sure he could keep up the charade. The interrogation room felt colder now. Michael's palms were sweating as he sat across from Detective Hayes, the silence between them thick and oppressive. His heartbeat seemed to reverberate in his chest, each thump echoing in his ears. The evidence was mounting, the walls closing in. His every word was now being dissected, every lie examined, and the truth was slipping further away from him. "You know, Michael," Detective Hayes began, her voice calm but laced with an undeniable edge, "it's strange how someone in your position would take such extreme measures. You were drowning in debt, yet you took out that life insurance policy. Why increase it by so much just months before Tiffany died?" Michael's gaze flickered to the table, but he forced himself to meet her eyes. The questions felt like daggers, each one driving deeper into his defenses. He had prepared for this moment, yet nothing seemed to be going as he had hoped. The perfect plan was falling apart right before his eyes. "It's not what you think," Michael said quickly, trying to steady his voice. "I was trying to provide for her, for the family. I thought she'd feel better knowing that, everything would be covered if something happened." "Something happened, all right," Detective Hayes countered, leaning forward slightly. "Something happened because you made sure it would." Michael's throat went dry. The words were true, but he couldn't admit it. He couldn't break, not now. He swallowed hard, glancing at the clock on the wall. The time was ticking. The pressure was building. His whole life had been spiraling downward for months, but now, as he sat in that room, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "You've been under financial pressure, sure," Hayes continued, her voice steady. "But what about your personal life, Michael? Was the financial strain really the only thing weighing you down?" Michael shifted in his seat. He could feel the heat rising in his face. He knew what she was getting at. They had already found the affair, the secret bank withdrawals, the strained marriage. He had buried it all, tried to bury it, but it was all coming to light now, and it was all starting to make sense. "Look, I wasn't happy," Michael admitted, his voice lower than he intended. He could hear the confession slipping out, uninvited, but he couldn't stop it now. "Tiffany and we just weren't connecting anymore. The pressure was too much, the bills were piling up, and then there was someone else. I was seeing someone at work. It wasn't supposed to go that far, but it did." There was a moment of silence as Hayes processed his words, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't look surprised. She had suspected as much. "You thought you could have it all, didn't you?" she said quietly, almost to herself. "You thought you could fix everything with one final move, the insurance, the escape, while keeping everything else intact. A perfect solution." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His heart was racing now. His mind was a blur. He had been so focused on the money, on getting out of the financial hole, that he had convinced himself this was the only way. He had convinced himself that Tiffany's death would fix everything. But now, in the stark light of the investigation, the truth was undeniable. His motives had been far darker than just escaping debt. "We found your emails, Michael," Detective Hayes pressed on, breaking his thoughts. "The conversations with your mistress about the future, about how things would change once Tiffany was gone. You didn't just want out of the debt. You wanted out of your marriage, too. You wanted a fresh start, and you thought this was the way to get it." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, as if the walls were closing in on him. Michael's breath caught in his throat. How much did they know? How far had they dug? He felt exposed, laid bare. "Why didn't you just leave her, Michael?" Hayes asked softly, leaning back in her chair. "Why did it have to be this way?" He didn't have an answer. He couldn't even look at her now. His hands were shaking. The room felt suffocating. How could he explain that in his mind, it had all made sense? The debt, the affair, the life insurance. It was supposed to be a clean break, a way to escape it all. But now, sitting in this room, facing the consequences, he realized how wrong he had been. Detective Hayes stood up, walking around the table slowly. She stopped behind him and leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "Michael, we know you're guilty. The evidence is clear. Your plan didn't just include getting out of debt. It was about a new life, without Tiffany. You wanted to start fresh, but you've destroyed everything in the process. Your wife is dead. Your children will grow up without a mother, and all because you couldn't deal with a few hard truths." Michael's breathing became shallow. His head was spinning. He had wanted to believe that there was still a way out, but there was no escaping now. The life he had planned for was shattered, and all the lies he had told to protect himself were coming undone. He had thought he was clever, but now he realized how foolish he had been. "This is over, Michael," Detective Hayes said quietly, standing beside him now. "You're not going to get away with this." The words were final, and in that moment, Michael knew he was trapped. There was no more running. There was no more escape. The world had already shattered for Tiffany's family, but now, as they gathered in the sterile, cold courtroom, the full weight of their loss began to settle in. Tiffany's sister, Amy, sat near the front, her eyes red from hours of crying. The children, Luke and Emma, were being taken care of by Amy's mother, their confused faces still haunted by the images of that tragic night. Michael, sitting across the courtroom in shackles, didn't look at them. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. It was as if he were trying to disappear into the chair, but he was already too far gone, too exposed, too guilty. Amy couldn't even look at him. How could she? How could she look at the man who had been her sister's husband, the man who had betrayed their entire family in the most unimaginable way? He was still wearing the same mask he had for months, the calm, the fake grief, the act that had convinced everyone around him that he was the same loving husband he had once been. But the truth was finally coming out. The trial was only in its early stages, but already the damning evidence was pouring in. The life insurance policy, the affair, the mysterious cash withdrawal, the gasoline at the scene. It all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Michael had killed his wife for money, for freedom, and it was all happening in front of them, the people who had trusted him. Amy glanced at her mother, who sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale and stiff. She couldn't bring herself to cry anymore. The tears had already flowed, but now a cold fury burned inside of her. They had trusted Michael. They had believed in the family, in the dream that he had once sold them, and he had destroyed it. "This isn't real," Amy whispered to herself. "This can't be happening." But it was real. Every word of the testimony, every new piece of evidence, made it more real than she had ever imagined. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the courtroom as they presented the case against Michael. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we are witnessing here is not just a tragedy. It is the cold-blooded murder of a woman by the person she trusted most. Tiffany Jones didn't die by accident. She died because her husband chose money over his own wife." Amy felt her hands tremble as she listened to the words. The prosecutor's voice grew sharper with every detail that was revealed. The life insurance policy had been increased just months before Tiffany's death, with no reasonable explanation. Michael had been drowning in debt, yes, but there was more. The affair, the stolen moments with another woman, the desire to escape his responsibilities, it all pointed to one thing. He had seen Tiffany as nothing more than a stepping stone to get what he wanted. "Michael Jones murdered his wife to escape his financial troubles," the prosecutor continued, "and he did so with a level of calculation that is both disturbing and heartbreaking. He didn't just take her life, he tore this family apart." Amy could hear the words, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. How could this be the same man who had been at family dinners, who had shared moments of happiness with her sister? How could someone so close, so trusted, become capable of such evil? The shock had started to fade, replaced by a deep, unrelenting sorrow. And then when she looked at the kids, she felt a fierce anger rise up inside of her. Luke and Emma would grow up without their mother because of the man sitting in front of them. They would have to carry the weight of this forever. Amy's thoughts were interrupted as the defense lawyer stood up, attempting to introduce doubt into the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution would have you believe that this was a planned murder. But what we have here is a tragic accident. Yes, Michael made mistakes, but no one is perfect. There is no definitive proof that he intended to kill Tiffany. It was an unfortunate event, nothing more." but the words fell flat. Everyone in the courtroom knew what had happened. Everyone except Michael seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Amy turned away from the defense lawyer's voice, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. She glanced over at Luke and Emma, who were sitting at the back of the room, their faces filled with confusion and fear. They didn't understand what was happening yet, but Amy did. She saw the way they flinched every time Michael's name was mentioned, the way they avoided looking in his direction. They knew. The trial dragged on, but it felt like the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Amy couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The family had been torn apart, and all because of one man's greed and selfishness. In the end, it wasn't just Tiffany who had died that night. The innocence of her children, the trust of a family, the hope for a future, had all been destroyed. And now Michael had to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom felt suffocating, a heavy silence hanging in the air as the prosecution presented their case. Michael sat still, his face expressionless, though his thoughts were anything but calm. The evidence was stacking up against him. The life insurance policy, the financial struggles, the murder he had orchestrated with terrifying precision. But there was something else, something more personal, that was about to surface. Detective Hayes had been thorough in her investigation. She had uncovered everything, the affair, the secret meetings, the stolen moments. And now, it was time for that part of the story to be exposed. The affair that Michael had been having with a coworker, someone who had never been mentioned, someone who had been a hidden thread in his life. As the detective stepped forward, she held up a set of phone records. The screen displayed several calls and text messages exchanged between Michael and the woman, his mistress. The jury leaned forward, and Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. The prosecutor's voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the air like a knife. These phone records show that Michael Jones was not just dealing with financial issues or a failing marriage. He was carrying on an affair with another woman in the weeks leading up to his wife's death. A woman who had no idea of the deadly plan unfolding in Michael's mind. Michael's heart began to race. He couldn't hide the panic in his eyes now. How much had they uncovered? How much had they pieced together? The affair had been his escape, his way to feel something outside the suffocating weight of his failing marriage, but now it was part of the puzzle that condemned him. The prosecutor continued, "These texts and phone calls, made late at night and during business hours, show a relationship that was more than just physical. Michael was making plans for a life with this woman. He wanted to leave Tiffany behind to start fresh, but he knew he couldn't do that until he was free of the financial burden, free of his wife." The room felt colder, the words cutting through the air with a cruel precision. Michael had hoped that his secret would remain just that, a secret. He had been so careful, so meticulous in keeping the affair hidden. But now, as the prosecution laid out the details of his betrayal, he felt the crushing weight of his own lies. Amy, Tiffany's sister, sat in the front row of the courtroom, her eyes hard as she listened to the testimony. She had known something wasn't right, but now the truth was laid bare. Michael had not only murdered her sister for money, but he had also been unfaithful, planning a future with someone else. The disgust she felt was palpable, but there was also something else, a sense of finality. The man who had destroyed her sister's life was finally being held accountable. The prosecutor turned to the jury. This affair was not just an escape for Michael, it was a part of his plan. He wanted to get rid of Tiffany, secure the life insurance money, and start over with a new woman. His actions were premeditated, calculated. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a crime of convenience. Michael could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, the weight of their judgment pressing in from all sides. He had tried to keep his composure, tried to hold it together, but now, as the affair was exposed for everyone to see, he realized how deeply he had underestimated the situation. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about betrayal, about the lies he had lived for months, and the woman he had cast aside. The defense tried to object, but the prosecutor pushed forward undeterred. The defendant's motivations go beyond financial hardship. The affair shows that Michael Jones was ready to abandon his family, abandon his wife for a new life, and that life required the death of the person standing in his way. Michael's fingers tightened into fists on his lap. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had tried to explain the affair away, tried to paint it as a momentary lapse, but now it was clear. He couldn't hide behind the lies anymore. Tiffany had trusted him, loved him, and he had thrown it all away for nothing more than his own selfish desires. The prosecutor paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle into the silence of the room. Then she added, Tiffany deserved more than this. She deserved a husband who loved her, a father who cared for their children. But instead, she got a man who would rather see her dead than face the consequences of his actions. Michael's mind raced. How could he have thought he could get away with it? How could he have been so blind? The affair, the murder, the lies. It was all unraveling in front of him, and he had no way of stopping it now. Amy's face was unreadable as she listened to the prosecutor's words, but Michael could feel her eyes burning into him. It was as if she could see straight through him, straight into the darkness of his heart. The family he had once been a part of was now irrevocably shattered, and he was the one who had torn it apart. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the prosecutor delivered her final words. Michael Jones was not just a man in debt, not just a man under pressure. He was a man willing to sacrifice his wife, his family, his entire life for the sake of a fresh start. And that is why we are here today, because he must be held accountable for the choices he made. Michael sat in the dimly lit room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The events of the past few days had collided into a nightmare, and he couldn't escape it. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the truth that had finally been uncovered. He knew it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down, but he didn't realize how quickly it would happen. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and Detective Hayes stepped inside. There was no warmth in her demeanor, no false sympathy. She was a woman on a mission, and she wasn't going to let Michael get away with it. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Michael looked up at her, his gaze deflecting, not meeting her eyes. "This is it, Michael," Hayes said, her voice firm but calm. "We have all the evidence we need. The affair, the life insurance policy, the withdrawals, the fire, it all points to one thing. You killed Tiffany." Michael's throat tightened. The words hit him like a slap, the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place in his mind. The weight of his own guilt threatened to choke him. He couldn't speak, couldn't defend himself. How could he? "Do you know what this means?" Hayes continued, her voice now softer but no less cutting. "It means your children will grow up without their mother. You took her from them for a life insurance payout and a fresh start with someone else." The truth of it all hung in the room, suffocating him. He had been so consumed by his own desperation, by the need to escape his life, that he hadn't stopped to think about the consequences. Not for Tiffany, not for his children, not for anyone. All he had wanted was freedom, and now he was facing the nightmare of it. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," Michael muttered, his voice shaking. "I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could get us out of the mess we were in, but I never wanted this. I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Hayes stepped closer, her gaze never leaving him. "You wanted her dead, Michael. You didn't just want to get out of debt. You wanted to get rid of her. You wanted a new life with someone else, and you thought no one would figure it out." Michael's hands were trembling. He wiped them on his pants, trying to control the shaking. He knew she was right. He had convinced himself that it was the only way. He had told himself that this would be a clean break, that no one would get hurt. But Tiffany had been hurt. His children had been hurt. And now his entire world was crumbling. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't see another way out. It felt like I was suffocating. The bills, the pressure, everything was closing in on me. I just wanted a way out. I didn't mean for her to die. It was supposed to be easier." Hayes shook her head, her expression hardening. "You don't get to play the victim here, Michael. You made a choice. A choice that cost a woman her life. A choice that tore a family apart. And now you'll have to answer for it." The words hit him like a physical blow. His head swam, the reality of what he had done sinking in deeper than ever before. Tiffany was gone. His children would never have the chance to grow up with their mother. And he had done it all for nothing. For a life that didn't exist. For a future that would never come. "I didn't think it would end like this," Michael whispered again, his voice cracking. "I thought I could fix it all. I thought I could make everything right." Detective Hayes was silent for a moment, studying him carefully. Then she sighed. "You can't fix this, Michael. You can't undo the damage you've done. The only thing you can do now is face the consequences." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no more excuses, no more lies to hide behind. He had crossed the line and there was no turning back. The only thing left was the truth, And the truth was more damning than anything else. He had killed his wife. He had betrayed her trust. He had betrayed his family. And now the consequences were here. He could feel them closing in, just like the walls of the room around him. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide behind his lies. "It's over," Michael said, his voice hollow. He leaned back in his chair, the reality of it all washing over him. I know what I've done." Detective Hayes didn't respond right away. She stood there for a moment, studying him before she finally spoke again. "You don't have to do this to yourself. You don't have to make excuses. Just face it." Michael didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The man who had walked into this room was no longer the same person who had planned the murder. He had been broken, and now he was forced to face the consequences of his actions. All the lies, all the schemes had led him to this moment, a moment of reckoning. The courtroom was filled with the low murmur of whispers as the jury filed in, their faces expressionless, yet tense. Michael sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His gaze was fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the people around him. He had always thought of himself as a good man, a loving husband and father, but now, as the trial unfolded, he couldn't escape the truth of what he had done. The trial had been dragging on for weeks, each day revealing more of Michael's dark secret. The affair, the life insurance, the fire. It all painted a picture of a man desperate to escape the life he had built. And now, here he was, facing the consequences of his actions. Tiffany's family sat just a few rows behind him. Amy, her sister, was there every day, her face a mask of grief and anger. Michael could feel her eyes burning into the back of his head. He had destroyed her family, and now she had to sit there and watch as the man who took her sister's life tried to defend himself. The prosecutor stood up, her voice cutting through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is the cold-blooded murder of a mother, a wife, a daughter, a woman who trusted the very man who killed her. Michael Jones had everything planned out. He wanted out of his failing marriage, out of his financial troubles, and he didn't care who he hurt along the way." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He had been trying to hold it together, but the weight of the accusations was too much. He had never imagined his life would end up like this, a life built on lies, betrayal, and murder. And now, he was paying the price. The prosecutor continued, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The increased life insurance policy, the affair, the financial troubles, the gasoline, the fire. All of it pointed to one thing. Michael had planned his wife's death to escape a life that no longer served him. "And what did he do after he killed her?" the prosecutor asked, her voice rising with emotion. "He walked away. He didn't try to save her. He didn't even call for help. He left her to burn. And why? Because he wanted the money. He wanted a fresh start with someone else. He thought he could get away with it." Michael could feel the eyes of the jury on him. He couldn't escape their gaze. They had already made up their minds. They knew what he had done, and nothing he said could change that. The defense attorney tried to speak, but it was clear that the case against Michael was too strong. There was no denying the evidence, no denying the truth. As the trial went on, Michael's mind wandered back to the night of the fire. He could still hear Tiffany's screams, her desperate cries for help. He could still see her face, filled with confusion and fear. He had done this. He had killed her. And the worst part was, he had done it for nothing. Nothing could bring her back. Nothing could undo the damage he had caused. Amy's voice cut through his thoughts as she stood up to give her victim impact statement. Michael had dreaded this moment, but now that it was happening, he could feel his heart sink. Amy stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. "I don't know how to describe the pain of losing my sister, the hole that's been left in our family. Tiffany was kind, she was loving, she didn't deserve this. And her children, they will grow up without their mother because of the man who was supposed to protect her." Michael's stomach twisted as Amy's words hit him like a blow. He couldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't face her. He had taken everything from her, from all of them. "You stole her life," Amy continued, her voice breaking, "and now you're sitting here trying to explain it away. There's no explanation for what you did. There's no excuse. All we have left are memories, and you've robbed us of that." Michael's eyes filled with tears. He had thought he could live with the guilt. He had thought that the money, the new life, would be worth it. But now, as Amy spoke, he realized just how deeply he had destroyed everything. The judge called for a recess, and Michael was left alone with his thoughts. The room was suffocating, and every breath felt like a struggle. The guilt was overwhelming, crushing him with the weight of his actions. He had never imagined it would come to this. As the trial continued, Michael knew that the end was near. He could feel the weight of the verdict looming, and he knew that there was no escape. His life, his future, had been built on a lie, and now the truth was coming for him. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Michael sat, his hands clenched tightly on the table, the faintest tremor running through his fingers. His mind was numb, the events of the past few weeks replaying like a slow-motion film, each moment, each word, each piece of evidence closing in on him. The judge stood, and the room fell even quieter. The jury had deliberated for hours, but now the moment of truth was finally here. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. It didn't matter that he had rehearsed for this moment, imagining it in countless scenarios. Nothing could prepare him for the weight of this moment. 12 jurors have heard all the evidence. The judge's voice rang out, cutting through the silence. And now, it is time for them to render a verdict. Michael's stomach twisted. He wanted to speak, to say something, to beg for mercy, but the words didn't come. There was no excuse, no justification. He had done what he had done, and now he was going to pay for it. The jury foreman stood up slowly, and Michael felt his heart stop. He didn't dare look at the faces of Tiffany's family members sitting in the front row, their eyes focused on him with the kind of intensity that burned through his soul. Amy, Tiffany's sister, was staring at him with an expression that was a mix of sorrow and disgust. She had heard the truth, the full truth, and she was waiting for justice. The foreman cleared his throat and spoke, his voice firm and steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Jones, guilty of first-degree murder and arson in the death of Tiffany Jones." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Michael's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the world seemed to spin. He had known this was coming, had known it deep down, but hearing those words, hearing the finality of them, sent a wave of despair crashing over him. Guilty. It wasn't just a word. It was a fact that he couldn't escape. The prosecutor stood up, her face a mixture of relief and resolve. "Your Honor, the state requests the maximum sentence. Tiffany Jones was a mother, a wife, and a daughter. Her life was taken in cold blood by the man she trusted the most. We believe the defendant's actions deserve the harshest punishment available." Amy's hands gripped the sides of her chair as she stood, her eyes never leaving Michael. She didn't feel a sense of victory. She didn't feel a sense of justice. All she felt was emptiness, the kind that only comes from losing someone you loved, someone who was taken from you in the most brutal way. Tiffany's children would never get to feel their mother's embrace again, and no verdict would ever give them that. The judge nodded, his face serious. "The defendant, Michael Jones, will be remanded to custody to await sentencing. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck the wooden block, and the sound echoed through the room, sealing Michael's fate. The air seemed to shift, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt a strange sense of release. The weight on his shoulders didn't lift, it just became heavier. There was no freedom for him, no relief, just the grim reality of what he had done. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, and walked toward the door, the guards leading him out. He couldn't look at anyone. He couldn't face the family he had destroyed, the children who would grow up without a mother. As he was led out of the courtroom, he caught a glimpse of Amy again. She was holding back her tears, her face a mask of quiet fury. He couldn't bear to look at her, but he knew he would never escape the image of her face. In the silence that followed his departure, the room felt heavy with a sense of finality. The family was broken, and no amount of justice would ever fix that. Michael had taken Tiffany's life, but in doing so, he had destroyed everything. The love, the trust, the family. And now all that remained was the cold, harsh reality of his actions. He had no one left, no one but himself. What do you think of Michael Jones and his actions? From which region are you watching this video? Please share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, how shocking do you find this story? Let us know your perspective.